Welcome to the 6th section of the C# 7 and .NET Core 2.0 recipes course by Pact Publishing. In the previous videos, we saw how we can use ASP.NET Core 2.0 to create web applications. But remember that we used in-memory mock data for our examples, and those examples weren't storing anything to the persistent storage. This section is dedicated to the Entity Framework Core, an ORM designed to work with ASP.NET Core so you can store, retrieve, and manipulate data from a database. We will begin with a short introduction to what an object relational mapper is and why you may want to use one. We will see how we can include the entity framework to our project. We will create a new database context from scratch that will essentially describe our database structure. We will then move on to working with migrations that lead to a more flexible way of introducing changes to the database structure. Finally, we will use dependency injection and the database context to create a small CRUD service for our application. Entity Framework is an ORM for C# applications. In this video, I will introduce you to the core concepts of an ORM. So in this video, we will start from the beginning. We will see what an ORM is and why we need one in our application. We will then see how we can include the Entity Framework, the most famous C# ORM, to a web application. The acronym ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper. ORMs are not exclusive to C#, of course, they exist for most languages that interact with databases. Let's try to dissect the term. The word object means the typical object representation in a programming language. For C#, that's usually an instance of a class or an anonymous object. The term relational refers to relational databases. If you don't have a lot of experience with relational databases, the term comes from the fact that SQL databases are based on relational algebra. And finally, the word mapper is what binds the two previous terms together. An ORM is what bridges the gap between the representation of an entity in the database and the representation of the same entity in the programming language. Let's see a simple example. For those of you that do not know what this is an ER diagram describing the relations among three database tables. We're describing a simple order management system where customers place orders that may contain one or more items. We have a table for each order, a table for each item, and a table that connects the two and allows an order to contain one or more items. On the programming language side, those entities are described by the following two classes. This is C#. The intermediate table will not have its own class because its purpose is to show the relationship between the order and the item. In the programming language, this is expressed in a different way. The relationship is represented by a list of items in the order class. But an ORM does not just offer a language-level representation of a relational database table. It also provides most database operations like insertions, updates, deletions, and joins. So most of the time, you won't have to write custom queries. Notice that I say most of the time and not always. Most ORMs and the Entity Framework included will allow you to run raw queries for when using the operations provided by them is not enough. Now that you understand the theory, let's include the Entity Framework Core to a web application. If you have created a project using the template that includes user authorization stored locally, then the Entity Framework is already included to your project so that there's a place to store the users. So let's start with a new project without authentication to see how we can include Entity Framework ourselves. Since it's a dependency, we're going to use the NuGet package manager to fetch it. We go to the Browse tab and we type in the search box Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. This is the SQL Server provider that depends and therefore comes with the Entity Framework Core. There are providers for several databases like MySQL or SQLite. Entity Framework Core is an open source ORM for C#, so it needs to support as many databases as possible. So chances are, if you're working with a less known database, if you search for it on the open source community or on NuGet, you're gonna find what you're looking for. The installation is complete, so we can go to our startup file and see how we can include the appropriate namespace for us to use Entity Framework Core. The namespace is Microsoft.Entity Framework Core, and sometimes you may need to also include the extensions namespace, as you will see in one of the next videos.